Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Long Form, the podcast produced by Jadaliyya. Our inspiration for these discussions is the well known quote by Antonio Gramsci, quote, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." I'm Bassam Haddad, and together with my co host Mouin Rabbani, we are exploring this theme with a series of guests whose work has provided valuable insights into these issues. For this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Craig Mokhiber, whom we've hosted before in the Gaza and Context series titled What Have We Learned? Israel's Genocide 1 Year On. Craig, I will welcome you in just a moment, but I want to say a few words about you. Craig Mokhiber is an international human rights lawyer and former senior United Nations official. He left the UN in October of 2023, penning a widely read letter that warned of genocide in Gaza, criticized the international response, and called for a new approach to Palestine and Israel based on equality, human rights, and international law. He has spent 4 decades in the international human rights movement, including more than 30 years at the United Nations. He is the former director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, held senior UN positions in Geneva, New York, and in the field, and undertook human rights missions to dozens of countries across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. He has served as the UN's senior human rights advisor in Palestine and in Afghanistan, led the team of human rights specialists attached to the high level mission on Darfur. And I must say, he also has a much longer bio, which we agreed to not share the whole thing, but it will be in the post and in this video at the outset. Uh, Craig, welcome to Longform. We are very delighted to have you again.
Well, it's so good to be with you, Bassam and Mouin. Happy to be here.
Hello.
Thank you, Craig. It's really great to have the opportunity for this conversation with you. And I'd like to start by asking you a general question that we pose to all our guests based on Bassam's introduction. Are we experiencing a transformation or disintegration of the international order, or is it just experiencing one more challenge from which it will recover and perhaps emerge even stronger? And specifically in this context, many people have pointed to Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip as the final nail in the coffin of the international order established after the Second World War, and of the institutions that have underpinned it. Do you agree with this assessment? Or is it just one more episode of repeated challenges to the order from which it will emerge intact?
Yeah, well, I mean, first I would say Gramsci's quote is exactly the description of what it is that we are going through at this moment. It is the time of monsters. The old order is definitely, I think, coming undone. But I think the answer in terms of what direction we're going is very much up to us. Because I think we are at this moment, we're facing both an existential threat to a very nascent, after all, international order, only about 80 years old or so, in which there was an attempt to build a norm-based order, an order based upon international law, international cooperation, international human rights. And now, that is being very much threatened, possibly dismantled. So that there's an existential threat to that, but there's also, I think, a historic opportunity. Every meaningful step forward in international affairs has come out of crisis, and we are in a very serious crisis. Whether we go down the road of total destruction and a return to absolute anarchy, which is the direction we're heading now, or whether there is a break in which we take the historic opportunity to build something better, that's what I mean when I say it's up to us. But I think this struggle is at least as old as the post-war order itself. The threats 80 years ago in the 1930s and 40s were one set of threats, and today we've got, on the one hand, the brutal march of Zionism, which is not only, I mean, people make the mistake of thinking it's only a threat to Palestine and maybe to the broader region of Western Asia, but it's actually a threat to the global international order itself. And then we've got, relatedly, and zooming back a little further, we've got a moment in history when I believe the American empire is dying, but that it will not go quickly and it will not go quietly. And there's a real risk that it will take the rest of the world with it if the international community writ large doesn't respond in the right way. And I think, Palestine sits directly on this kind of global fault line between those who believe that we should have a global order that's determined by violence and aggression and war and, let's say it, imperialism, a word you never hear in the halls of the United Nations, but which is the dominant force of everything on which the United Nations works. And on the other hand, on those who demand the building of reliable international systems that are built on international cooperation, the rule of international law. And the challenge comes because the most powerful states, indeed, the US-led West, has come down firmly now on the side of imperialism, colonialism, Zionism, white supremacy, and on the side of violence as the principal tool of foreign policy and of foreign affairs. But, I have to say in the same breath that overwhelmingly, I believe the world, including the vast majority of UN member states, essentially most of the global South, global civil society for sure, they are expressing their solidarity with the people of Palestine on the one hand, but also on this vision of a world that is governed more by the rule of law. It's not a naive vision. I understand that power is the most important factor, but I think that there are models that have been tested over the course of the last 80 years that can mitigate the abuse of power at the international level, just as there are mechanisms at the national level that mitigate the abuse of power. So I think we have a choice. I think we're involved in a historic struggle, and I think this is the time of monsters, but we have choices to make.
If I could just follow up on that, you referred to an international order that was established after the Second World War, but it has in fact been developing since then. If you look, for example, at the membership of the UN, if you look at new human rights conventions, new institutions such as the International Criminal Court, could the ferocity of the efforts to undermine this international order be seen as motivated by these developments? Because you could arguably make the argument that this is a somewhat different international order than that which was envisioned in 1945. And related to that, why do you view the current genocide in the Gaza Strip as such an important turning point? I mean, we have, for example, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Why don't you focus on that as the turning point? What is so distinctive about what we're seeing in Gaza?
Well, I think you're right to raise 2003 as an important moment as well in the erosion of the international legal order and a sort of a shift in the direction of international affairs more towards just bald imperialism as opposed to what was happening in international institutions. So I wouldn't in any way dismiss the importance of that moment. This is just the next, it seems to me, qualitative step up in terms of the ferocity and the brutality. And I think you're right. It is a reaction in part. We're watching Donald Trump now attack every UN agency, withdraw from UN agencies, defund UN agencies, justify the attacks on UNRWA, withdraw from the Human Rights Council, block action in the Security Council. There is an attack on international institutions precisely because, and it's not brand new, it's just reached a new level of ferocity, as I say, but precisely because they were, to some degree, mitigating the raw imperial power of the US and its minion states elsewhere. And you can see this most in the viciousness with this. The US has just appointed a new ambassador to the United Nations, and I've been watching the confirmation hearings of UN ambassadors from the US for years, going back several ambassadors, because they have such a big obstructive impact on what it is that the United Nations tries to do. And once again, they've picked a vandal. They've picked just a sort of a crazy person whose job is to go and just make trouble and obstruct the UN and to oppose, most especially, any critique by UN human rights organizations of the Israeli regime. That's the number one point of inquiry in the hearings in the U.S. Senator for the confirmation of ambassadors to the
Stefanik.
UN. Yeah, in this case, Elise Stefanik, who made her name, whose political career has been bankrolled by the Israel lobby, one of the largest recipients of AIPAC funding, who made her name by attacking students and professors who defended the free speech of students who were speaking out against Israel's genocide in Palestine. And now they have unleashed her on the UN to obstruct. Why are they so focused on spending so many resources and so many efforts that they would make the principal purpose of their ambassador to the UN that deals with all issues of peace and security and human rights and development and public health and air traffic and everything else? Why is the principal focus of their entire foreign policy machine on this one repressive foreign regime of Israel in the Middle East? Because the thing that they have not, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, I think, but the thing they have been unable to do is to silence the part of the UN that is norm-based, that does not compromise the human rights norms and standards and treaties when it reviews the situation of Israel and Palestine. They've tried for decades to shut that down. They had some significant success during the Oslo period, where they got the UN to shift its focus away from international law and onto an amorphous political process that they controlled. But now that isn't happening. And they remember very well that everything significant that was developed in the UN's human rights program came not when the UN was dominated by a small group of Western states in its early years, but after the flood of former colonial countries that had gained their independence and then joined the UN as independent countries and immediately started to prioritize international law, human rights, self-determination, and the struggles of colonized people like the Palestinians. So they see that threat very much, and their attacks on the UN are very much reactions to that, to be sure. They can do a lot of damage. The Security Council, of course, is absolutely blocked from doing anything meaningful because of the U.S. Veto. There are many state delegations to the UN, as you know, that are completely captured by the U.S. with its various sticks and carrots. The senior-most UN officials are cowed into relative inaction or even complicity in some cases by US and Western pressure and threats and deceptions, and especially the funding faucet, which the US turns on and off according to its whims and schemes. And when it does, too many UN officials willingly trade off the very principles and mandates of the organization, which is not new either. You know, Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the second Secretary General of the UN, probably the most principled, not perfect, but probably the most principled. He underscored and struggled with this tendency during his tenure as Secretary General in the 50s and up until 1961, when he died suspiciously in a plane crash. But he came down very strongly on the side of this principled approach. He may have paid for that with his life. You know, he once famously said something to the effect that any result brought at the price of compromise with the principles of the organization is not worth it, because it weakens the organization in a way that will be a definite loss for the future that cannot be regained and cannot be balanced by any immediate advantage achieved. There are too many in the UN these days who make those deals because they are under the whip, principally of the United States, but also of its European allies, the UK, the Germans in particular, who are large funders of the United Nations. And then, having made that compromise, they slip further and further into complicity and ultimately, I think, into irrelevance. There hasn't been a Dag Hammarskjöld on that post since. It's not an accident. Whenever a Secretary General is selected, the U.S. always raises this old quote: "We want a Secretary General who is more secretary and less general." And I think that's very much happening today as well. There was a lot in your question. If I missed anything, please come back to me.
No, I think you answered it quite comprehensively, and we're going to talk further specifically about the UN. Just one last follow up on the general question. I mean, you've discussed it, but in your view, what's next, or is it still kind of an open contest between those who are trying to demolish the international order and those who are trying to transform it into something better? And because you said it depends on us.
And if I may, before you answer, Craig, you know, in terms of the standards of what is acceptable and what is not, in the past 5 years, 10 years, if you will, we've seen a number of developments regarding race, gender, and so on, whereby if people used to look back decades ago, things were sort of somewhat constant, and then something happened. We're not going to address why now. Something happened where certain things have become less acceptable or unacceptable in cultural, social terms. Is there anything of the sort happening at the level of international legal institutions where, yes, it's business as usual in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but maybe that business as usual is no longer as acceptable? Is there something of the sort happening? Just to tag on to what Mouin said in terms of what's next.
There's a lot happening. I think the assault on international law, international order, international human rights is a very, very vicious assault. They're pulling out all the stops this time around. And it's not just the sort of head-on attack of the United States. It is, varying levels of complicity, especially of other Western countries or countries that collaborate with the United States, even from the global South. But there are also things happening in reaction and resistance to this, because I think the situation is creating opportunities as much as it is creating risks. So, for example, you see the rise of the BRICS group, which was very much dismissed just a few years ago as something that was, moribund from the start and wasn't going anywhere. That's clearly not the case anymore. It is step by step growing in terms of its influence and its reach. You see it in the establishment of the Hague Group of states that came together, these 9 countries in The Hague, to say that they were committed to implementing the concrete requirements of the International Court of Justice and of the General Assembly to hold Israel accountable, including embargoes and not allowing their ships to pass through their ports and so on. That is a development that would not have happened during the Oslo years, but it's happening now in response to the current situation. Global civil society has stepped up in a way that I think is unprecedented in my lifetime, and is insisting on a more principled approach at the international level and a more active approach on the part of international institutions like the human rights institutions, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. People who knew nothing about these institutions just 2 years ago are now very much focused on their operations. So something is building here that could bring a shift. And again, there's nothing new under the sun, I recognize. And if you look at the state of international affairs around Palestine before Oslo was adopted, what you saw was that there was a period in which, led by the global South, you had around Palestine, the principal focus of international action was around human rights, the right to self-determination, the right to resist, opposition to Zionism as racism and as colonialism, and on this idea of self-determination, which are jus cogens, erga omnes. There's just a bunch of Latin phrases in international law to say the single most important principles of international law, including self-determination. All of that was abandoned with the ruse, I always say, of Oslo. And now you see a bubbling up again, especially from the global South, of an emphasis on those principles and challenging the United States and the Israeli regime in their assault on these principles. So I think we may very well see, a split between these forces in international fora that will lead to something new, something better, or it will all be destroyed, and we will be returned to anarchy at the international level. I mean, we're at a moment in history when some of the most powerful states in the world, including the most powerful empire in the world, have said genocide is okay by us. And if genocide is okay, then anything is okay. And you see that now in the United States, the same governments and everything behind those governments that have been okay with the genocide from the beginning have been ratcheting up their attacks on their own people inside the country, brutalizing them in the name of an oppressive foreign regime. So, yeah, the battle lines, I think, are pretty clearly drawn.
Thanks, Greg. How has all of this, in terms of some of the details, been reflected in the institution where you've worked, UNHCR, and the UN generally? And if you can also discuss specifically how they have responded to Gaza since you called them out on it very, very early. What were the signs and what were the consequences of their failures in the context of what we're addressing, even though you've touched on some of these topics?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to always, when you're talking about these international institutions like the UN, you have to ask which UN you're talking about, as I think you and I have discussed before. On the one hand, you have the political corridors of the organization, which have completely abdicated their responsibilities under the charter, under the international treaties and declarations and resolutions, who have, either because they are cowed or corrupted by the power of the U.S. and its Western alliance, have simply traded off the very idea of the organization in deference to power. And I think Mouin has spent some time in the UN. He knows that there is a big trend within the United Nations of people who think that deference to power is somehow political acumen. That if you just triangulate and see where the power is and stay within the safe space, that shows that you're sophisticated. And if you challenge power inside these international organizations, that's viewed as, well, you don't know how to play the game, and that has left some of the most important potential mechanisms of the organization to defend international law, international human rights, self-determination. That has left them out of the struggle altogether. They have simply bowed to power. But there's another part of the UN. There are the norm-based institutions, the independent human rights mechanisms like the special rapporteurs, witness Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur, the other special rapporteurs on food and health and housing and so on, the independent commissions of inquiry, the independent treaty bodies. They have stood up almost without exception and have just done a principled job in legal analysis and advocacy and public representations, where they come down entirely on the side of decency and therefore on the side of the Palestinian people, on the side of international law. Or if you look at many of the humanitarian agencies that under considerable pressure have continued to do everything they can, not just to provide relief to the victims of genocide in Palestine, but also to speak out against Israel's crimes, even though that makes their life even in some cases more difficult. Or, the hundreds of UNRWA workers murdered along with their families simply for staying and doing their job. They are also the UN. They're also a part of the international mechanisms. And we can't feel like completely hopeless, because today the Israeli regime is on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. Imagine this a couple of years ago. The Israeli regime is on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. The absolute impunity of the regime built up by the West over all these 80 years is beginning to crumble. That is not nothing. That is important. Its leaders are the subject of arrest warrants for crimes against humanity, including extermination, at the International Criminal Court, right? The ICJ has declared unequivocally that the Israeli regime is guilty of apartheid and racial segregation, that its occupation of the Palestinian territory is entirely unlawful and must end entirely and quickly. The UN General Assembly, the political body, has declared overwhelmingly that all countries must comply with the findings of the International Court of Justice on Palestine. Its independent special procedures, its commissions of inquiry, the Human Rights Council, they have exhaustively documented Israel's crimes. They've affirmed its culpability for genocide. And Israel's actions have been condemned by every major international human rights organization repeatedly, over and over again. And that's why, to go back to the original question, it's precisely because of this very dramatic shift on the Western project of Israeli impunity, where some of that is now beginning to crumble, that you see this upsurge in violence and lawlessness by the U.S. government, by the Israeli regime, and so on. But even that, I think, can end up having an upside. The U.S., what we've witnessed in the UN, there's a mythology, especially in the U.S. and amongst the U.S.'s European allies. For years, they tried to tell a story about how the U.S. is imperfect, but basically it's on the side of human rights. And it plays a positive role inside the UN and international bodies. That is entirely false. The U.S., on balance, has always played, its major role that it's played has been in obstructing international human rights and the international human rights agenda. It has always imposed most of the international human rights agenda. The United States has always opposed economic and social rights as rights. So that's half of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They have always opposed the right to development as a human right, especially for countries of the peoples of the global South. They've always opposed the international agenda on the abolition of capital punishment. They have always opposed the international agenda against racism. They have always opposed the international human rights agenda on indigenous peoples. They've always opposed the international agenda on the Palestinian people. They've always opposed the International Criminal Court. The U.S. has used its wealth, its power, and its influence to obstruct most of the international human rights agenda long before Donald Trump came into these mechanisms. So if you imagine a situation in which U.S. influence in these bodies is diminished, yes, you can imagine some immediate hardship as significant amounts of funding are pulled away from these bodies, but you can also imagine a freeing up of these bodies and the resources that they do have. You can imagine a rallying of other countries and other sources to step forward and make sure that the defunding is not fatal. And you can imagine, again, advancing the agenda that we saw in these international mechanisms before they were distorted by Oslo and by other U.S. unipolar imperial obstructions. So yeah, it's a difficult moment, but it also is a moment, I think, of extraordinary opportunity.
Just getting back to Bassam's question. I mean, you were very early in raising the alarm about not only what was happening in Gaza, but about the response of the UN. I mean, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, we know that the Secretary General spent months in a Herculean effort not to mention the word Israel when hundreds of his own staff and their families, as you mentioned, were being slaughtered, who, in all the press statements were passively leaving this world. And of course, the head of your own organization, the Human Rights Commission, took his time to issue more than anodyne statements. So there seems to be a distinction between individuals of conscience and agencies and organizations and leaderships that, for the most part, as you mentioned, try to play the game. But you did see the early signs and warn about them. Given that we're still talking about the second half of October 2023, what made it so obvious for you, not only what was happening in the Gaza Strip, but also specifically about the failures and negligence of the UN, the Human Rights Commission, its political leadership and so on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had a long-term view because I had been in the United Nations for 32 years, and I had watched the trajectory, which was a very negative trajectory when it came to Palestine, and particular, which, as I've said, I think was very much rooted in this the charade of Oslo that managed to derail anything principled within the organization. So I had seen this trajectory. I had seen also developing over time a growing tendency within the United Nations to become more and more cautious and trepidatious in pronouncements from the political side of the House about what, and when I say the political side of the House, I mean the Secretary General, his appointees, the heads of agency, the heads of departments, and so on, to become more and more cautious and trepidatious in pronouncements on Israel because they were afraid. Because they were afraid of being demarched by the Americans or the Brits or the Germans, because they were afraid of attacks from these Israel lobby assault groups that have popped up in recent years.
Anyway.
So, which comes anyway, no matter what you do. You would think they would learn that lesson because repeatedly they get punked, so they'll sort of claw back and silence themselves and adjust statements and so on, and then they get attacked anyway as anti-Semites and supporters of terrorism, all the usual games. But somehow that lesson wasn't being learned. And what I saw was a reduction in principled approaches over time that had just reached, by 2023, an outrageous level, where I thought that they were abandoning the principles of the organization and abandoning their mandates. It had gone that far. You have a lot of room for diplomatic maneuver. But they had gone so far in the direction of compromising principles in deference to power that I thought that it had gotten out of hand. And when this new government took control of the Israeli regime in January, I started to speak out.
January 23.
January of 2023. I was speaking out publicly. By the way, as I always had about dozens of countries all around the world during my tenure at the UN, I was a UN human rights official. It was my job to speak out based on international law in terms of the abuses that were taking place. And so I was speaking out early on. I was raising the specter of genocide even in the spring of 2023, long before October, because not just of the statements that were coming out of the new government in the Israeli regime, but at the actions in the West Bank, including wholesale pogroms in Hawara village and elsewhere in the West Bank. And what I saw was an almost absolute silence coming out of the political corridors of the UN. And then, I mean, it's an old story by now, but then they tried to silence me. So they had been demarched by the Israelis and the Americans and the Israel lobby harassment groups and so on. And for the first time in my 32 years, I was told to shut up and that I shouldn't say anything that hadn't already been said by either the Secretary General or the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
And this is prior to October 23.
This is prior to October. It was in the springtime. And no one had ever said that to me. And even in that case, that only applied to Palestine. Didn't apply to any other human rights abuses coming out of any other countries. And I thought we had reached a really dangerous moment there. And I had, I had witnessed the Oslo process. I lived and worked for the UN in Palestine for 2 years in the 1990s. I had done a series of missions there, beginning with the first Intifada before Oslo and several times after that. And I had seen the shifting role of the UN and the way that it had abandoned international law, abandoned accountability, abandoned addressing root causes, right? So if you listen even now to the statements of the Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, other senior officials, they will say things like both sides need to respect international law. We need to get back to negotiations toward a two-state solution. We need to send in more humanitarian aid. That is the safe language of conflict between two warring parties. It is not the language of genocide. And what you will never hear coming out of their mouths, and this is what I was critiquing at the time, was any attention to the root causes of settler colonialism, apartheid, ethno-supremacy, racism, inequality, racist violence, occupation, and so on. You won't hear a word murmured about those things. You will never hear the kind of language directed to Israeli perpetrators that the Secretary General happily directs toward weaker states, or toward Hamas, for example, where the adjective horrific is automatically attached to everything he says, but never to the genocide perpetrated by Israel. And you will never hear the word genocide. Instead, what they will do, even if they're asked directly, they'll say, only a court can determine if it's genocide. But they never say that for war crimes. They never say that for torture. They never say that for any other crime. But when it comes to genocide, they retreat behind this kind of safe language. And worse, over time, intentionally, the political side of the UN has built up an alternative set of mechanisms that are not independent, that are not based upon human rights, that are not attached to the UN Human Rights Program in Geneva, but are controlled by the Secretary General, are entirely political, and they have played a terrible role during this period. You have
Can you be more specific?
Yeah, special advisor on genocide, on the prevention of genocide. You have a special advisor on children in armed conflict. You have a special advisor on sexual violence in armed conflict. The special advisor on genocide was silent about the genocide.
Absent without leave.
Yeah, and even after the World Court had pronounced and issued provisional measures and have found that genocide was plausibly happening, still didn't step up, because it is designed to be silent. It is designed to be something that is politically controlled. And I know a lot about that office because I was involved in its setup decades ago. And then similarly, you had even worse things happening to some degree in the special advisor on children in armed conflict, who, by the way, year after year after year, receives all the information from the human rights mechanisms about abuses of the rights of children in armed conflict in the occupied territories. And every year, the Secretary General and the special advisor remove Israel from the blacklist that is annexed to that report. You have the special advisor on sexual violence and armed conflict that actually, without any kind of due diligence, repeated the genocide propaganda of the Israeli regime on sexual violence perpetrated on October 7th, without any evidence, and quoting sources that were long since debunked as propaganda. That was designed to create space for Israel to perpetrate genocide against the Palestinians. That whole architecture in the political offices of the UN was constructed so that the Secretary General wouldn't be burdened by the independent human rights mechanisms, which are pesky because they tell the truth and because they stay true to the norms and standards. So I spoke out about that, the situation, and already in the spring I indicated that I couldn't continue to work like this, and that I would be leaving the organization in the coming months.
This is after you were given the order to remain
up.
mum on Palestine.
Yeah. And so I said, okay, I can't continue to work like this. I can be better on the outside where I can speak freely about these issues as a human rights lawyer, which is what I am trained to be I've been in the international human rights movement more than 40 years. What's the point of sitting there in silence when I had a visible position at the United Nations? So, and then, of course, the situation continued to get worse and worse and worse, and reached a peak in October with the expediting of the genocide, because I never say that the genocide began in October. I believe it began long before, that there had long since been an agreement between Israel, tacit or otherwise, that incremental genocide would be permitted. Periodic military attacks on Gaza, the gradual taking over more and more of the West Bank, the denial of more human rights, the arresting of more prisoners, the torturing of more people, that sort of incremental genocide that had been going on since 1947, that's okay. But because it provided a level of comfort for Israel's Western sponsors. But what happened in October was that they returned, like during the Nakba, the original Nakba, they returned to an expedited genocide. And at that point, I wrote my second letter, which was the one that went viral, saying that genocide was happening in Palestine. We're not reacting properly. We are failing again. And in fact, the organization's entire approach to Palestine is completely wrong and needs to be returned to a more principled approach. And that was a letter to the High Commissioner, which I also shared with the Secretary General's office, but interestingly, it was leaked by somebody in the organization to Israel lobby groups. And the Israel lobby groups then published it, thinking that they were the ones. By the way, there was a campaign against me by these Israel lobby organizations to get me fired and to smear me and so on. And they thought that by publishing that, they would somehow be harming me further. That didn't happen at all. In fact, I think the letter resonated inside the UN and outside the UN. I don't think they served their cause very well with that particular assault.
Greg, I want to go back to our local setting in the United States in a minute. But first, one quick question about Stefanik and at the UN. You had commented in a couple of places that she will actually face more of an opposition because the straight out lies that she tells, for instance, about October 7th and many other racist claims she makes. Like, for instance, when one of the Congress men asked her if she supports Smotrich and Ben Gvir's view about the West Bank being God-given to Israel and therefore they have the right to claim it and like in practice. She basically, after trying to avoid, she said yes. A lot of what she says in one of your commentary, you said will not fly at the UN. First, who might actually respond? In what capacity or in what kind of format? And third, does it really matter if she is not believed at the UN?
I think it matters. I think that the U.S. has, under both Biden and Trump, has completely destroyed its own. They've consumed so much international political capital in defense of Israeli impunity, especially over the course of the last year and a half, that is going to cost them. It's already costing them, right? There's a lot of reputational damage that they have endured on behalf of this rogue regime in the Middle East. I think that she will fail in most cases. I think she'll fail because she's ignorant. She knows nothing about the facts of the situation. She delivers Israeli lobby talking points and Christian fascist talking points, which have a constituency in the United States. They do not have a constituency in the United Nations amongst the majority of member states, amongst the international human rights mechanisms, or even in the political corridors, people who actually know the situation on the ground. I was at the United Nations through the tenure of John Bolton as ambassador to the UN. And, periodically the US likes to just throw something into the UN to break things, right? Bolton had dedicated his whole career to trying to dismantle the UN. They made him the ambassador to the UN. We had to sit in conference rooms with this incredible bore who was just vulgar and destructive and obstructive. That did a lot of damage to U.S. diplomatic relations. The other diplomats hated this guy. And everyone who worked in the UN, I hated this guy. He was so obnoxious. He is Gandhi compared to Elise Stefanik. Elise Stefanik is just this ignorant, a person who was bought and paid for by the Israel lobby and can only deliver their talking points. Now, I have to say, after all these decades in working in international affairs, usually U.S. diplomats are not very skilled diplomats. They're not like these countries that have very skilled diplomats because they're small, they punch above their weight, they carve out a particular role. Countries like Liechtenstein and Switzerland and Cuba have very, very skilled diplomats. U.S. diplomats typically aren't skilled. They tend to be appointed without any diplomatic experience. Even the ones who do, who are career diplomats, have come up in a situation where they don't need diplomatic skills because they have power. They have carrots and they have sticks, and they have a broad remit where the State Department doesn't try to make them behave in reasonable ways. And so you often will be in conversations with U.S. diplomats in the UN who are just, obnoxious and vulgar. I used to refer to it as this particular thing that I called Americans, which is a combination of ignorance and arrogance that was typical of so many of these U.S. Of these U.S. diplomats. So she can do damage if she can do very serious damage if the senior political leadership of the United Nations doesn't recognize that they are in an existential moment for the very purpose of the organization and stand up on principle. There's a very good chance that many of them, including those at the top, will bow down to whatever she says. And if that happens, then you're back to the Dag Hammarskjöld quote that they are compromising things that they will never get back, and that could do very serious damage to the organization. But if they just stand up in a reasonable, I'm not saying go to war with Elise Stefanik, I'm saying just hold fast on the principles of the organization because it's your job to do so. If you're not strong enough to do that, resign and let somebody else have that job. But she will have zero influence over the human rights mechanisms, the experts in the organization, most of the countries that are member states of the United Nations. All she can do is cause more harm to those relations. The Human Rights Council, from which they've withdrawn, by the way, so they're not going to have any influence there at all. But the human rights mechanisms and the organization itself, she has no influence, no legitimacy, no credibility, just because she's been granted plenipotentiary powers by the government in Washington. She is in the battle of wits at the UN. She is unarmed.
Sorry, Bassam, go ahead.
Sorry. So no, thanks for that. I hope some of what you're sharing actually transpires. And I go back to my earlier note and question about whether we live in times where what was acceptable in the past might not be as acceptable, and that's definitely a wish, but there are concrete developments that speak to the potential realization of this, perhaps with a serious time lag, and that time lag might be longer than we wish. I would like to turn back to the domestic setting. Mouin, do you want to address anything about the UN before I do that?
No, I think that's we've discussed it quite thoroughly. I would just like to make one point in that you drew a distinction between these kind of political agencies operating directly under the Secretary General and the human rights agencies. Yet the one you worked for, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, failed spectacularly enough that you felt you had no choice but to resign. So is that also a function of, let's say, the politicization of these agencies that are supposed to be the repositories of the international community's norms and values?
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of disquiet in the ranks in the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights because of this situation. After my letter went out and after I left the organization, I was swamped with communications from colleagues within the Human Rights Office, both in their headquarters in Geneva, in the New York office, and in the 100 or plus countries around the world where they had offices, fully supporting and expressing solidarity with the messages that I had delivered. There's been a lot of frustration amongst them since then. You see, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights is kind of a hybrid. It's not like the Department of Political Affairs or the Department of Peacekeeping or the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, where you have an Undersecretary General who just is essentially implementing what the Secretary General wants. Yes, the High Commissioner of Human Rights reports to the Secretary General, but he has a mandate separate from the Secretary General, from the General Assembly, and he reports directly to the member states, not through the Secretary General. They are reports of the High Commissioner. They're not reports of the Secretary General. That means that there is a modicum of political space that the High Commissioner of Human Rights has that other senior political figures in the organization don't have. The current High Commissioner of Human Rights, who was a protege of Guterres, of the Secretary General, and who comes from his political offices, an Undersecretary General in the 38th floor in the office of the Secretary General, and then was appointed by Guterres as High Commissioner of Human Rights, has embraced entirely the Secretary General's own approach, his own rhetoric, his own reticence, if I may say so. And that has meant that that office has not been able to have the impact that it could otherwise have under other leadership. And it has in the past, when Navi Pillay, the South African judge who now heads the Commission of Inquiry, when she was the High Commissioner for Human Rights, she was viewed very much as a problem by the political corridors in New York because she stayed true to the mandate and to the mission and took principled positions that, of course, irritated member states. But if you have a mandate to do human rights work, and you think, which is all about the accountability of states for what they do to people, and you think you're going to avoid critique of states and a principled position, don't take the job. Don't take the job. So yeah, unfortunately, in spite of the brilliant staff who are at OHCHR, who are doing very principled work and who are very much on board with the kinds of things that we talk about, it has been, because of the political leadership in both New York and in Washington, it has been less impactful than it otherwise could have been and should have been.
Craig, I'd like to go back to the local setting and ask a question that's based on a note on social media regarding Mahmoud Khalil. And I'll quote, a lawful, that's your quote, these are your words, a lawful permanent resident of the U.S. abducted at his home by a group of men in plain clothes who did not identify themselves, ripped away from his pregnant citizen wife in New York, no warrant, no charges, no crime until today. That's my interjection. Disappeared and then re-emerged 1,400 miles away, where he was locked up, initially denied his meds, his lawyer, contact with his family, or even a blanket, threatened with deportation and still held, all for simply protesting against the genocide being committed by the Israeli regime. The government's response, and then you quote, "We're going to do a lot more of this." Besides the sort of, the instinctive remark, what the hell is going on? There still is not much that they can do, right? Given the almost absence of a case against him. Where do we stand on this, and what sort of precedent is this, and how do you read this act? Is it is it what authoritarian regimes do? Apparently, we're beginning to perfect this practice in order to dissuade others, or is it more of a starting point for more to come?
Yeah, it's both of those. I mean, I think that this is an extremely dangerous signal to people in the United States and more broadly that the government in Washington is completely lawless. That this is a government that, I mean, they know perfectly well. It's not like they don't have some lawyers. They know perfectly well what they did is not lawful. What they're doing is they're testing the institutions to see how much they can actually get away with. And even if they don't get away with it, as long as they are in power, I expect that they're going to continue these kinds of abuses. Witness now the case of these the hundreds of people rounded up by the government, put on airplanes and flown to El Salvador to be thrown into one of the most notorious prisons in the world, based upon a contractual agreement for $6 million between Trump and the president of El Salvador, without due process, without trial, without even verification that they have committed any crime or dangerous in any way, without hearings for asylum, without immigration law being applied. They simply rounded them up, often on the basis of them having tattoos, and then shipped them off. And here's the worst part. The ACLU brought suit. They managed to get a court to declare that this needed to stop. The court ordered the Trump administration to bring those people back. They were flying them out at that moment. They were over the sea, ordered to bring them back. The Trump administration refused the order of the court, delivered them to this abusive prison, and then posted joking tweets, oops, so sorry, with a little crying emoji. In other words, declaring to the world they will not be constrained by the law, by the rule of law, or by US courts. The same thing, happened with Mahmoud Khalil, in the sense that nobody suspected him of a crime. Nobody suspected him of having engaged in any kind of violence. Nobody suspected him of having breached any of the conditions of his green card, of his status as a lawful permanent resident. He was removed, and members of the Trump administration made this very clear, for protesting against a genocide being perpetrated by an oppressive foreign regime that the United States government supported. For speech. That's why he was removed. They knew nothing about him. Initially, they declared that he was here on a student visa. He wasn't. He was a permanent resident. They declared that he had made the usual stuff about anti-Semitism. There's no evidence of a single anti-Semitic statement of any kind. They declared that he had connections to terrorism, which is a very dangerous thing in this country and in the West, because they will use that as an excuse to lock up people for all sorts of reasons. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. They launched a campaign to smear him in corporate media. And I'm talking about, not just Fox News and these kinds of crazy things, but all of the networks in the US went along with this smear campaign against a guy who was a student, married to an American citizen, a lawful permanent resident, who the law in the US says has the same free speech rights as anyone else in the US, including citizens. They just sent a bunch of thugs following superior orders to take this guy, put him in chains, and drag him off hundreds of miles out of the district in which he lived, to bring him to a jurisdiction that they thought might not respect the law so much because of its anti-immigrant tendencies, so that they could deport him without cause. And he is still being held simply for opposing peacefully a genocide being perpetrated by an oppressive foreign regime. This is a lawless government that is in power in the United States. And I don't say that to contrast it with the Biden administration, which was also a lawless government that was a perpetrator in genocide in Palestine and committing crimes elsewhere. But this is, I think, another shift in the level of abuse that the U.S. government is willing to undertake, all in defense of this one foreign regime. It's very, very dangerous.
Can I just ask, because you keep emphasizing that that the United States is doing this on behalf of an oppressive foreign regime that it supports. So now if you look at eras where the US's own interests were directly at stake, and I'm thinking of the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, similar issues, McCarthyism and so on. Is there anything comparable to the best of your knowledge?
I think those things are important in comparison. My entire life, the U.S. has been at war. Every day that I've been alive, the U.S. has been at war. And in every one of those wars, the U.S. was the aggressor. So these kinds of crimes abroad are nothing new, to be sure. But the degree to which this government is willing, and the previous government is willing to oppress people within its own borders in order to defend the impunity of the Israeli regime, that is remarkable. Not that students weren't punished during the Vietnam War for their protest. Many of them were, but it wasn't this kind of blanket repression and an effort to silence and to spread a climate of fear in the minds of not just students but faculty and others, ordinary citizens in the country. That you are not allowed. There's not, you can, in the United States of America, you can criticize the U.S. government. You can criticize 193 other country governments. You can criticize capitalism and socialism and anarchism and greenism and feminism. You can criticize any political ideology except Zionism. You can criticize any state except Israel. You can call for the defunding of any regime in the world except the defunding of Israel, because in the United States of America, for doing that, you can be punished. You won't be punished. So there is something very particular about this one foreign regime compared to others. You can march on campus and in the streets all you want against Iran or Saudi Arabia or Myanmar or China or whatever you want to march against. It is only in this case that you will feel the full weight of the US Congress, the office of the president, university administrations, local law enforcement. This is only reserved, this kind of repression, for those who speak out against this one particular regime. So you have to say that there's something different happening here. Now, as we said in the beginning, there's nothing new under the sun. This is reminiscent of McCarthyism. I think this attempt to try to create fear in the minds of people so that they don't dare to say the forbidden things that you're not allowed to say. But this is in modern history, this is absolutely unique. Now, I don't see the value of the old debate about, well, is it the Israel lobby that is compelling the U.S. to act this way, or is the U.S. acting this way because of its own imperial interest? It can be both. It is both in my view. But the level of capture, not just of the levers of foreign policy in the United States government, but now in domestic and even law enforcement policy in the United States, is absolutely unique. There is no other foreign country or foreign cause that is more directly influential on domestic policy in the United States and foreign policy in the United States than that of this one small oppressive foreign regime called Israel. Very dangerous indeed.
Mouin, um, shall we conclude and release Craig, or do you have any parting questions?
Well, maybe one last question. We've your resignation has repeatedly come up in this discussion, and its motivations, and you've also referred to let's say an outpouring of support that you received, including from within the organization. So I'd like to ask you again about, let's say, the personal dimension of this issue that we've been discussing. Has there been, for example, a smear campaign against you? You know, not only from the usual suspects, but by the leaders of your own organization that you worked for several decades, in order to kind of belittle your concerns, disgruntled employee, and all the other familiar tropes. Could we maybe conclude with, and I realize, you know, there are much bigger issues at stake than one individual's career. But having said that, I think we'd be very interested to hear about that aspect, particularly given now also the unprecedented domestic repression that you've just discussed.
Yeah, I've never been 100% comfortable talking about my part in all of this, because in the beginning, in October of 23, a part of the Israel proxy campaign against me was to try to distract attention away from what I said in my letter and the substance of the thing, and onto me personally. When they started the campaign, they hired some of their minions, and they did. You both disappeared. Are you there?
Yeah, we're here.
You both disappeared. So in the beginning of the campaign against me by these Israel proxy groups, they hired some minions and they did all this research on everything I had ever said publicly going back to the 1980s, looking to find something through which they could accuse me of being an anti-Semite. And they couldn't find anything. So instead, they put together all of my tweets and public statements and so on, created like a thread of every criticism I had ever made against the state of Israel. And they said, well, he criticizes Israel so much, he must be an anti-Semite. Of course, that didn't include my criticisms of dozens of other countries around the world for their human rights violations. And so they got very frustrated that they weren't able to harm me. They tried to get me fired. They tried to go after my pension. They tried to do all sorts of things, and they failed in doing so. And so then they just went on the usual smear campaign, not just on social media, but outside of social media. That never dug in, because what I discovered very early on is, they would say something about me, and then the response from, the web would be 99% supportive of me and of the message that I was delivering, and against them. That didn't work. But now when I get occasional death threats, and I got a lot of, death threats and all sorts of threats, personal attacks of all kinds. Now when I get those, I just ignore them. I just delete them and send them on their way, because I know a big part of the tactics that they employ are fear tactics. They want to make us afraid to speak out. And I've always believed, and I said this in my letter and to the senior leadership, when these attacks come, the best strategy is to speak louder and more, because if they see that you are being cowed, then they will continue their attacks more and more. And that seems to, I think, have been proven to be true. And then you have these Israel lobby groups that will go before Congress and try to smear me in front of the Congress and so on. All of these kinds of things. From the UN itself, the response was interesting. Overwhelmingly supportive for my colleagues. From the leadership at the UN, absolute silence. So no one ever answered my letter, for example. No one acknowledged. I shouldn't say no one. That's not true. A couple of senior officials in the Secretary General's office acknowledged it and thanked me for it. But the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to whom it was addressed, and others never said anything about it. They cut off all contact with me. When I was leaving the UN, colleagues had put together a big sort of farewell for me. The senior officials in the UN canceled the farewell, and colleagues had to meet me in Midtown Manhattan in secret for fear of retribution. The UN tried to make it less of a story by saying it was just a routine retirement, and it had nothing to do with the policy in the organization.
There was no protest involved, in other words.
Right. No, you just retired and left when. So all of those things, the claim that I was fired, I wasn't fired. They actually asked me to stay, interestingly, but they asked me to stay and shut up. I left specifically because of what the UN was doing, what it was saying, its approach to Palestine, and its attempt to silence me. I made that very clear that was the reason that they left, but they tried to downplay the story as much as possible. So their tactic was just to try to be silent. But there was a bit of a crackdown on other staff who were then speaking up to show that no more of this. We can't we can't tolerate that. I have to say I have not suffered because I don't fear these kinds of smears. I think that they have overused the "you are an anti-Semite supporter of terrorism" bullshit. Nobody falls for that anymore. Nobody. Because everyone, without exception, who has in any way criticized the state of Israel has been immediately smeared as an anti-Semite. And the fact that the Trump administration here in the US is claiming that everyone they go after is an anti-Semite is just weakening more and more that threat, which I regret. There is a real thing called anti-Semitism out there that we need to work in solidarity to oppose, to be sure. But that's not anti-Semitism. And I've said it time and time again. If criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, then why is it that criticism of Iran or Saudi Arabia is not Islamophobia? Why is it that criticism of Myanmar is not anti-Buddhist? Why is it that criticism of Modi in India is not anti-Hindu? The world has come to recognize this for what it is, which is an empty smear designed to silence people who are defending human rights, and we're not going to be silent.
Thank you, Craig. Unfortunately,
Yes.
we are holding this conversation as Israel just yesterday, continued its slaughter and killed what we know now is about 419 people, with hundreds injured and probably as many under the rubble, because no one can get to them for the lack of equipment and vehicles and so on. Before we leave you, can you tell us a little bit about what you think, and if you think this matters anymore in the international legal sense, especially that a number of countries have come out with much stronger criticism, and including Western countries, than they have ever come out before in the past 15 months? Or how many is it now? 17 months?
17, I think.
Considering the ceasefire.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have been saying that I don't think there ever was a ceasefire, personally. I think it was another fig leaf. It was something that was out of convenience to the Trump administration for a short amount of time. I don't think Israel, in its conversations with Trump, ever committed to an actual ceasefire. I think this was, clearly it wasn't a ceasefire. And I said, I posted this morning, it was not a cease genocide for sure, because all they did was they shifted the focus of their military attacks to the West Bank, killing more people and having a more extensive military assault on the West Bank that we haven't seen since the invasion in 1967. They increased the amount of ethnic cleansing on the West Bank. They increased the number of prisoners that they were seizing and taking away to their torture centers on the West Bank. And they continued periodically to attack people in Gaza throughout the 2-month period of the ceasefire. And they continued to obstruct desperate humanitarian aid throughout the period, of the 2 months. And so there never was a ceasefire. There never was a cease in the genocide. And what I hope this has done, I have said, is revealed that the U.S. is not a mediator. For God's sake, why does the international community still go along with this pretense of the U.S. as a mediator? The U.S. in Palestine is a perpetrator. That's what the U.S. is, not a mediator. It has done nothing to enforce the agreement. It has done nothing to hold Israel accountable for its breaches. And to the contrary, it has continued to arm the genocide during the entire period of the ceasefire, so-called, and to run cover. So it was not, this genocide didn't end. It created a distraction for a short amount of time. I don't think anyone's going to fall for this kind of nonsense in the future. They've spent it now. We have to just keep up the push. We have to, the answer is pressure from civil society, pressure from movements, pressure from labor groups, pressure from human rights defenders, boycott, divestment, sanction, anti-apartheid action, legal action in the International Court of Justice, legal action in the International Criminal Court, legal action in the domestic courts of the West and of the South, pushing for an implementation of the embargoes and the isolation of Israel that have been demanded by the International Court of Justice and by the General Assembly of the United Nations, trying to build initiatives like that of the Hague Group, remembering what happened in South Africa when the West was entirely on board with the apartheid regime until it no longer could sustain that because of domestic pressure in the West. That I think that's the mission of all people who believe in human rights, who believe in decency, is to make sure that that pressure is turned up. This genocide will continue until its logical conclusion or until the world stops it from happening. And our job is to try to bring that pressure to bear.
With that very cogent and potent call to arms, Craig Mokhiber, we conclude our discussion. It's really been a very insightful and revealing and rich discussion in which we've benefited so much from your expertise and experience, and really helped us kind of get a much better understanding not only of this moment but how we got here and where we're going. So we'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us for long form conversations.
Well, it's
Thanks,
been my
Greg.
honor. Thank you. Thank you, Bassam. Thanks, both of you. It's just an honor to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. And you know you again you created a problem for everyone else because your conversation with us and your presentation and so on doesn't leave room for any editing. So that's always a plus. And unfortunately, it looks like we will reach out to you again, Greg, given what's happening.
Anytime. All my solidarity. Thank you both.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Take care.
Excellent discussion.
Sorry.
Excellent discussion. We've been very fortunate in our choice of guests on this podcast.
Absolutely, I really enjoyed it, and I did mean what I said regarding how his flow and ability to string things together without a hitch is really remarkable. So
Yeah.
I'm very happy that we've done this again, and I wasn't kidding. It looks like we will call on him in the future as
We most definitely will.
the recent events speak of the continuation of the intensity, not even just the continuation of the horrible situation, but the intensity of it.
And yeah, to have someone who not only has so much knowledge but also knows how to convey it so clearly is a rarity, and it's a rare skill.
Yep, with also the integrity he
Yes.
demonstrated
Well,
by resigning. All right, so we move on.
we move on.
We might actually have to reschedule one of our next events because of the developments, recent developments. But we shall see. All right, Maureen. Good to be with you again. Always,
Always, Bassam, Habibi.
Habibi. Salam. Take care.